The blizzard had raged for 2 days, a relentless assault of wind and snow that buried the landscape in a deep, silent white. Stepping onto his porch, coffee mug warming his hands, an old rancher named Silas scanned the transformed world. Amidst the vast alien landscape of snow and ice, Silas spotted a small shape. But it wasn't just any animal. It was a bobcat, frozen nearly lifeless. He brought the frozen predator into his sanctuary. But what happens when a wild bobcat wakes up not in its den, but in a strange room, staring into the eyes of the man who saved it? The man wasn't prepared for what happened next. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The silence was the first thing that truly registered. For 2 days, the world had been a screaming banshee of wind and horizontal snow, a blizzard of such ferocity that it seemed intent on scouring the very memory of the landscape from the Montana high country. The wind howled through the lodgepole pines with the sound of a grieving giant, and the snow had piled in immense sculpted drifts that transformed the familiar contours of Silas Blackwood's ranch into a hostile alien moonscape. On the third morning, the world held its breath. A fragile, crystalline quiet descended, so profound that the drip of melting icicles from the eaves of his cabin sounded like drumbeats. Silas, a man whose 73 years were etched into his face like a map of the very mountains he inhabited, stood on his porch. The ceramic coffee mug, a faded gift from his late wife Eleanor, felt warm and solid in his gnarled hands. A small anchor in the vast white sea. He scanned the transformed world. The sun, a pale wafer in the washed-out blue sky, cast long, distorted shadows across the snow. His old barn, a stoic sentinel of weathered silver wood, looked half swallowed by a drift that swept up its side like a breaking wave. It was then that he saw it. A small, unnatural mound against the barn wall, just where the wind would have been at its most punishing. It was a smudge of tawny brown and black against the otherwise immaculate white. It wasn't a fallen branch, he knew that, nor was it a piece of forgotten machinery. Curiosity, a trait that had kept him sharp long after his body had begun its slow, grudging decline, overrode the instinct to simply stay warm. Setting his mug down on the porch rail, he pulled his thick sheepskin gloves on and stepped off the porch. The snow gave way with a loud, satisfying crunch, swallowing his boots to the shins. Each step was a labor. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was an animal, curled into the tightest possible ball, a desperate attempt to conserve a final flicker of life. A bobcat. Its beautiful spotted coat was caked with a fine, sparkling layer of ice, making it look more like a taxidermist's forgotten project than a living creature. Silas knelt, his old knees protesting with a series of cracks and groans. He knew what this meant. Deep, powdery snow was a death sentence for a bobcat. Their paws, though formidable weapons, were small compared to their lynx cousins, lacking the broad, snowshoe-like structure that allowed the lynx to glide over the powder. A storm like this one would have confined any sensible bobcat to its den. This one, likely a young male judging by its size, had been caught out, inexperienced or desperately hungry. With a gentleness that belied his rough-hewn appearance, Silas used a gloved finger to brush away the ice crystals from its face. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible flutter of whiskers, and then the slow, shallow rise and fall of its ribcage. It was alive, but only just. The spark was fading fast. A debate, old as the hills themselves, raged in his mind. The pragmatic rancher in him, The man who had shot coyotes for threatening his chickens and scared off bears from his stores screamed that this was a predator. A cornered, frightened wild animal, no matter how small or weak, was a bundle of teeth and claws. Bringing it into his home was an invitation for chaos and injury. But another voice, a quieter and more persistent one, spoke up. It was the voice of the man who had lived in these mountains his whole life, who understood the brutal, impartial cruelty of nature. Leaving this creature to perish felt like a profound failure, a violation of an unwritten code that demanded respect for the life that struggled so valiantly to exist here alongside him. It was also Eleanor's voice, a soft echo in his memory. She'd been the one with the soft spot for the wild things, the one who'd leave out Suet for the jays and scold him for cursing at the deer that ate her tulips.
Everything's just trying to get by, Sai.
She would say, her hand on his arm.
Just trying to make it to the next sunrise.
The memory settled it. He wouldn't let this sunrise be its last. With a grunt of effort, he pushed himself back to his feet and trudged to the barn. The air inside was still and frigid, smelling of old hay and horse liniment. He grabbed a thick, scratchy horse blanket from a hook, its wool fibers smelling faintly of his old mare, Daisy, who had passed on 2 winters ago. Returning to the Bobcat, he worked with the slow, deliberate patience of a man accustomed to handling nervous livestock. He brushed away the snow from its body, his hands moving with a practiced economy. The animal was rigid with cold, its muscles locked tight, its body a taut knot of desperation against the inevitable. He carefully slid the blanket underneath it, then folded the heavy wool over, creating a makeshift sling. Lifting the stiff, surprisingly light body, he began the slow, arduous journey back towards the cabin, a strange rescuer carrying his natural-born foe. He didn't take it into the main cabin. The workshop, a lean-to addition he'd built himself 30 years ago, was the perfect place. It was insulated, and his pot-bellied stove, Old Vulcan, sat squat and black in the corner. He laid the blanket-wrapped Bobcat on a pile of clean, empty burlap sacks a safe distance from the stove. Too much heat too quickly, he knew, could send the animal into shock, a thermal whiplash just as fatal as the cold. He stoked the stove, adding seasoned chunks of pine that caught with a satisfying whoosh and crackle. The iron began to radiate a gentle, pervasive warmth that slowly started to push back against the room's chill. Then, Silas retreated. He pulled up a 3-legged stool, sat down near the doorway, and waited. For hours, the only sounds were the hiss and pop of the fire and the mournful whisper of the wind picking up again outside. Silas watched, his gaze unwavering. He drank another cup of coffee, ate a cold biscuit, and watched. He began to fear he was too late, that the spark had already been extinguished in that frozen solid body. He thought about Eleanor, about the countless times they had sat in comfortable silence, just being together. The silence in the workshop was different. It was a heavy, expectant silence, a vigil between life and death. Then he saw it. An ear, tipped with a jaunt black tuft, twitched. It was a tiny spasmodic movement, but it was there. A surge of something, hope, maybe, or just profound relief, washed over him. An hour later, a deep shudder ran through the animal's entire body, a violent, involuntary tremor as its nervous system began to fire up again. As the life-giving warmth slowly, painstakingly seeped into its frozen limbs, the Bobcat began to stir more purposefully. Its head, once resting limply on the burlap, lifted. Its eyes, the color of rich, dark amber, blinked open. They were unfocused at first, glassy and confused. Then, they sharpened. The pupils dilated as dawning awareness flooded its wild mind. It took in the strange surroundings, the vertical lines of the plank walls, the unfamiliar scent of sawdust, gun oil, and man, the oppressive, dry heat radiating from the iron monster in the corner. And finally, its gaze locked onto the largest, most immediate threat, the two-legged giant sitting silently by the door. A low, guttural hiss escaped its throat. It was a sound born from the very soul of the wild, a clear, unambiguous warning that vibrated with fear and latent aggression. The fur along its spine bristled. Silas didn't move a muscle. He didn't speak. He simply held its gaze, keeping his own posture relaxed, his presence as calm and unthreatening as he could make it. He was a mountain, ancient and unmoving, not a predator. The bobcat, weak as it was, struggled to its paws. Its legs trembled, unsteady as a newborn foal's. It took a stumbling step, then another, backing away from the heat and the man. It found refuge in the deep shadows beneath a heavy workbench, a space cluttered with old paint cans and coils of rope. There, it collapsed into a crouch, a small, terrified creature trying to make itself invisible. Its tufted ears were pinned flat against its skull, its amber eyes glowing out of the darkness, tracking his every tiny movement. For the rest of the day and deep into the night, they maintained their silent standoff. It was a delicate, unspoken truce. Silas knew the animal needed water and food, but he also knew that any attempt to approach would be seen as aggression. He filled a shallow bowl with fresh water and placed it on the floor, about 10 feet from the workbench. Beside it, he set down a plate with a few strips of venison left over from his dinner. Then he retreated to his stool. The bobcat ignored the offerings. Its wild instincts, honed over millennia, screamed that this was a trap. The pangs of hunger and thirst were powerful, but fear was stronger. The next morning, a subtle change was visible. The bobcat's shivering had stopped. When it moved, its movements, though still cautious, were less shaky. Its strength was returning. Frustrated by its confinement, it began to pace the length of the workshop, a caged storm of wild energy. It moved with a liquid grace, a silent, fluid motion that spoke of its predatory nature. It leaped onto the workbench, scattering tools with a clatter, then jumped silently to a stack of firewood, its eyes constantly flicking between Silas and the single window high on the wall. It was looking for an escape. Silas spent the day talking to it, not in a commanding or coddling way, but in a low, conversational murmur. He told it about the blizzard, about the ranch, about Eleanor. He spoke of how she would have marveled at its spotted coat, its fierce spirit.
She always said the prettiest things had the sharpest thorns, or in your case, I suppose, the sharpest claws.
He rumbled softly, watching the cat freeze and listen, its head cocked.
You're a handsome fella, I'll give you that. Stubborn too, just like her.
The sound of his voice seemed to have a strange, calming effect. The bobcat's pacing slowed. It still watched him with an unblinking, wary intensity. But the frantic edge was gone. That evening, under the cover of dusk, Silas saw it happen. The bobcat crept from its shadows, silent as a ghost, and lapped greedily at the water bowl. Then, with a suspicious glance in his direction, it snatched a piece of venison and retreated back under the workbench to devour it. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. On the third day, the world outside was bright and dripping. The great melt had begun. Silas knew it was time. His chest felt tight with a strange mix of emotions. He was relieved to be ending the tense cohabitation, but a part of him felt a pang of something. Sadness? He had grown accustomed to the silent company, the shared space with this sliver of pure, untamed wilderness. The workshop would feel empty again. He put on his coat and gloves, then walked slowly to the large double doors of the workshop. The bobcat watched him, its body tensed. With a loud groan of protesting wood, Silas heaved one of the heavy doors open. A blast of frigid, clean mountain air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. The bobcat froze, its nose twitching, its whole body quivering as it tasted the scent of freedom. It looked from the brilliant white world revealed in the doorway, back to the old man standing beside it. It held his gaze for a long, unreadable moment. In those amber depths, Silas looked for a sign, a flicker of understanding or gratitude, the kind of connection a man might share with a dog he'd rescued. He saw nothing of the sort. There was only the powerful, inscrutable mystery of the wild. It was a creature whose life he had unexpectedly preserved, a life that owed him nothing. With a final, cautious glance, the bobcat made its decision. It didn't saunter or slink, it bolted. A flash of spotted fur and coiled muscle, it launched itself through the doorway. It hit the snow, vanished into a shallow ravine, and reappeared a moment later on the far side, a fleeting shape moving with incredible speed towards the dark sanctuary of the tree line. It never once looked back. Silas stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the spot where it had disappeared. The silence it left behind was heavier than before. He had done the right thing. He had honored Eleanor's memory. He had tipped the scales of nature back toward life. But as he slid the heavy door shut, enclosing himself once more in the quiet solitude of his life, he couldn't shake a feeling of profound and utter loneliness. Weeks passed. The snow receded, revealing the bruised and battered land beneath. The rhythms of Silas's life returned to their familiar, solitary cadence. He mended fences broken by the weight of the snow, cleared fallen trees from his access road, and spent his evenings by the fire, reading old paperbacks with the pages softened by countless turnings. The bobcat became a memory, a strange and vivid chapter in his long life. Sometimes, in the quiet of the workshop, he'd find himself glancing towards the dark space under the workbench, half expecting to see two amber eyes glowing back at him. He'd seen tracks once down by the creek, the distinct round prints of a bobcat. He wondered if it was the same one, thriving now, hunting the rabbits and squirrels in its territory. He hoped so. One afternoon, in the lingering sunlight of late winter, Silas was working on the far edge of his property. A section of fence that bordered the national forest had been damaged, not by snow, but by a large fallen ponderosa pine. He needed to clear the log and restring the wire before his neighbor's cattle, due to be moved to their spring pasture soon, decided to wander onto his land. He had his chainsaw with him, and the work was hard and hot, despite the lingering chill in the air. He'd cut the massive trunk into manageable sections and was using a heavy peavey to roll the rounds out of the way. He was wrestling with a particularly large, knotty piece, his back screaming in protest, when a sudden stillness fell over the forest. The chattering of the squirrels ceased. The cheerful chirping of the juncos went silent. Silas froze, his hand still on the peavey. Every instinct, honed by a lifetime spent outdoors, went on high alert. The silence was not peaceful. It was a taut, terrified hush. He slowly straightened up, his eyes scanning the dense woods around him. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. He could feel it, a prickling on the back of his neck, a primal sense that he was being watched. His rifle was propped against a tree stump about 20 feet away. Too far. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, his eyes fixed on the shadowy tangle of undergrowth from which the feeling of menace seemed to emanate. And then he saw it. A ripple of movement, a fluid shift of muscle and shadow. Low to the ground, a massive head emerged from behind a thicket of buckthorn. The creature was the color of pale honey, its body a symphony of lethal, condensed power. A mountain lion, a full-grown male, huge and confident, its long tail twitching almost imperceptibly at the tip. Its yellow eyes were fixed on him with a chilling, predatory focus. It wasn't merely curious. It was hunting. Silas's blood ran cold. He had seen mountain lions before, but always at a distance, fleeting glimpses of a retreating form. He had never been the object of one's attention. He knew he was in mortal danger. He was an old man, slow and tired, reeking of sweat and effort. To the lion, he looked like what he was: easy prey. He took another shuffling step back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The lion mirrored his movement, emerging fully from the brush. It was even bigger than he'd thought, well over 150 pounds of sleek, deadly grace. It lowered itself into a stalking crouch, its belly brushing the forest floor, its powerful hind legs bunching beneath it, preparing to spring. Silas knew he had seconds at most. He made a desperate calculation. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't reach his rifle. His only chance was to make himself look big, to shout, to appear more dangerous than he was. He raised his arms, the heavy peavey still clutched in one hand, and opened his mouth to roar. But before any sound could escape his throat, a streak of mottled brown and gold erupted from the trees to his right. It was an explosion of fury. The Bobcat. It shot across the clearing like a cannonball, a guttural shriek tearing from its lungs. It was impossibly fast, a blur of spots and claws. It wasn't his Bobcat, or rather, he had no way of knowing for sure. But it was a Bobcat, and it was attacking the mountain lion with a suicidal ferocity that defied all logic. It was a fight between a welterweight and a heavyweight champion. The Bobcat was utterly outmatched in size and power, but it fought with the heart of a demon. It launched itself at the mountain lion's face, a screaming, spitting vortex of claws and teeth. The cougar, shocked by the sudden, insane assault from its smaller cousin, let out a startled snarl. It recoiled, shaking its massive head to dislodge the attacker. The Bobcat clung on, its claws digging deep into the larger cat's cheek and neck. For a few frantic, chaotic seconds, the two animals were a single, tumbling mass of fur and rage, rolling on the forest floor in a flurry of snarls and screams that echoed through the silent trees. The mountain lion, enraged and bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts, finally flung the Bobcat off. The smaller cat hit the trunk of a pine with a sickening thud and fell to the ground, momentarily stunned. The lion, its hunt interrupted and its face a mess of scratches, turned its furious yellow eyes back to its intended prey. But the moment had been broken. The element of surprise was gone. The Bobcat, shaking its head, staggered back to its feet. It was limping, and its side was stained with blood. Its own, or the lion's, Silas couldn't tell. But it lowered its head, flattened its ears, and let out another blood-curdling hiss, ready to charge again. The mountain lion looked from the defiant, wounded bobcat to the old man who was now slowly, carefully, backing towards his rifle. The easy meal had become a complicated, painful ordeal. With a final, disgusted snarl that seemed to convey its immense frustration, the great cat made a decision. The fight wasn't worth it. It turned, and with a flick of its long tail, melted back into the shadows of the forest, vanishing as silently as it had appeared. The silence that returned was even more profound than before. It was the silence of survival, of a battle won against impossible odds. Silas stood, breathing heavily, his hands shaking. He looked at the bobcat. The animal stood its ground, 20 feet away, its small body trembling with adrenaline and pain. It looked at him, and for the first time, Silas was certain. It was the same one. He recognized a small, V-shaped notch in its left ear, a detail he had noticed while it was recovering in his workshop. Their eyes locked across the small, snow-dappled clearing. The gaze was still wild, still untamed. But this time, it was different. There was no fear in it, no aggression. There was a flicker of something ancient and profound. Not gratitude as a human would understand it, but a deep, primal acknowledgement. A debt recognized and a debt repaid. The law of the mountain, in its own brutal and beautiful way, had been balanced. The bobcat held his gaze for another long moment. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible dip of its head, it turned. Limping heavily, it dragged itself into the undergrowth and disappeared. Silas didn't move for a long time. The peavey fell from his nerveless fingers and thumped softly on the pine needles. He finally retrieved his rifle, his movements stiff and automatic. The walk back to the cabin was a daze. That evening, as the last alpenglow painted the peaks in shades of rose and lavender, Silas sat on his porch, a mug of coffee untouched beside him. The world was the same, yet entirely different. He was still a lonely old man in a vast, empty landscape, but he no longer felt alone. He had a secret now, a silent pact with the wilderness itself. He had reached across the chasm that separates man from beast, not to tame or to conquer, but simply to offer warmth in the face of the cold. And the wilderness, in its own unbelievable and terrifying way, had reached back. He looked out at the dark tree line, where his unlikely guardian now roamed. A faint smile touched his lips. He could almost feel Eleanor's presence beside him, her warm hand on his arm.
See, Si?
He could hear her whisper on the evening breeze.
Everything's just trying to get by. Sometimes they just help each other along the way.
And in the deep, quiet peace of the mountain twilight, Silas Blackwood finally understood. He had not just saved a bobcat, he had saved a part of himself, and in return, had been given a gift more precious than he could ever have imagined. He had been reminded that even in the most solitary of lives, connections are forged in the most mysterious of ways, binding the man to the mountain and the heart to the wild.